Hi, thanks for joining this webinar. This webinar is on organizational form for community land trusts, and specifically for early stage community land trusts that are trying to decide what form their organization will take. You won't necessarily have to make all of these decisions right at the beginning, but I think it's important to preview some of the decisions you'll want to start thinking about when it comes to your organization's form. So first off, what do we mean when we say organizational form? We mean the corporate and legal form your CLT takes. This is separate from but related to organizational structure, which is kind of about the specifics of how your CLT is set up internally to carry out its mission, like governance aspects, membership board, reporting structure. So the form is about how your CLT is incorporated, like what form of corporation it becomes, if it has any kind of legal associations with other corporations, if it's a subsidiary, if it has charitable status, those sorts of things. And there are a number of factors that will influence your organizational form. One big one is the initiation model. This is kind of where a CLT comes from. I covered this in the webinar on community organizing for early stage community land trusts, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Another factor is the availability of appropriate and willing partners. So some of these will not be options for you if you don't have partners, organizations that you could partner with to make them happen. Organizational values, so it's going to depend which organizations are aligned with your CLT's values. And also planned and available revenue sources will be a major factor. So a brief recap of initiation models and how it relates to organizational form. So the two kind of main initiation models are community-initiated CLTs and nonprofit-initiated or public-initiated CLTs. If a CLT is community-initiated completely and doesn't have any association or affiliation with an existing nonprofit, it's most likely just going to be incorporated by that community group as an independent nonprofit. But if it's initiated to an extent, at least by an existing nonprofit, there are several options and different pathways it might take. So we're going to kind of focus on those and talk about what those might look like. So, the options would be independent nonprofit, conversion, affiliate or subsidiary, or program. And there are kind of shades of gray between all of these options. A CLT could be grassroots in origin, but receive support in early stages from an existing nonprofit while retaining independence. Most CLTs do have some kind of relationship with an existing nonprofit in the early stages. So it's important to kind of understand what that relationship could look like as it and could evolve into as the CLT grows. So there are four main trajectories, like I mentioned: independent nonprofit, conversion, affiliate, subsidiary, or program. I'm not going to go into conversion because that essentially would mean the sponsoring nonprofit becomes a CLT, which is not really common. That might be in the case of a nonprofit that's a housing provider or a developer, where basically all of its assets become part of the CLT. A lot of the pros and cons here are similar to the pros and cons that I spoke about in the previous webinar when it comes to community-initiated CLTs if you're forming a fully independent nonprofit. So you'll have clear governance and accountability because you're setting up kind of a whole new organizational structure, and you'll have the ability to shape your organization's strategy independently from the founding nonprofit. The cons are it involves incorporating a new nonprofit, which may take longer and require more decisions to be made. It may also limit the CLT's ability to benefit from the founding nonprofit support and credibility in the long term. An example is Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. They were initiated as a project of the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center, which was an existing nonprofit with deep ties within its community. After several years of community organizing and some in-depth research on housing and other land-based needs in the area, they incorporated PNLT as an independent nonprofit that doesn't have any ongoing kind of legal ties to Park. Affiliate or subsidiary, it's kind of a midway point in terms of independence and support. It means incorporating a new nonprofit with ongoing ties. So often that means some kind of ties between the founding nonprofit's board and the CLT's board. So that could be designated seats for representatives from the founding nonprofit, or that founding nonprofit might be fully appointing the board, which would mean that the founding nonprofit was the only member of the CLT. or the only voting member potentially. A similar subsidiary, as opposed to affiliate, usually denotes more direct control. The pros are they benefit from the credibility and support of the founding nonprofit, but they do have some separation via independent legal status. They've been independently incorporated. But the cons are there could be a complicated balance between control and autonomy with the founding nonprofit, and it might limit the CLT's ability to have this kind of classic CLT governance structure with an open membership and a board elected by the membership. An example is CLT by CHFBC, they were formed as a separate nonprofit but strongly tied. CHFBC has a lot of sway, and they appoint the board of the CLT. But that does mean that the CLT benefits from CHFBC's resources, relationships, reputation, and advocacy work. Another pretty uncommon journey is forming a CLT as a program of a sponsoring nonprofit. So that means that the nonprofit has other programs that are not the CLT, like a food bank, youth services, etc., and also has a CLT as a program of that. Effectively, that means that the nonprofit becomes a CLT. So in a sense, it's kind of the same as conversion. This could also be the case where a nonprofit housing provider decides to operate some, but not all of its housing as a land trust. But, this kind of blurs the lines a bit of what it means to be a CLT. The pros are this could be quicker and easier to get started, and they could benefit from the existing nonprofit's resources and reputation. But the cons are they'd have limited autonomy. There's no autonomous board. There's only one corporate board here because there's only one corporation and one corporate membership as well. And you'd have a limited ability to implement anything resembling the classic CLT governance model with an open membership and elected board. So this slide just summarizes some of the pros and cons. One other thing that might influence your decision, whether you want to maintain strong ties with your sponsor nonprofit, is access to the benefits of charitable status. I'm going to talk more about the implications of charitable status in a later workshop, but there are a number of reasons that your CLT might not choose to apply for charitable status. It limits your land uses in some cases, or what you can, how you can hold your land. It limits your advocacy work. There's an additional administrative burden, and some feel that a charitable status is kind of ideologically opposed to some of the core kind of tenets of the CLT model. So if you're not a charity, how do you issue, how do you kind of benefit from some of the things that come with being a charity? And there are ways to do this, but you have to be quite kind of careful about it. And the charities that you partner with will want to be really careful about it as well. So when a charity partners with a non-charity nonprofit, the charity itself is ultimately responsible for ensuring charitable dollars and charitable resources are spent properly. That is, they have to be spent in line with that charity's charitable objectives, since they're the ones who need to report to the CRA. That also means that they're kind of taking on the bulk of the risk. So they're ultimately in control of the project, at least legally. The legislation around this has changed a bit in recent years, and we'll get into this more in the webinar on charitable status. But it's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your organizational form. So I want to close with an example of how one CLT has maximized its ability to meet its goals through its unique organizational form. And this is kind of an example of how sometimes you might find it beneficial to incorporate more than one new nonprofit, with each one carrying out different roles. And I'm using this example because it's one that people often ask about and are curious about. So as I mentioned before, Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust was initially incubated by Park, a local charitable nonprofit. So they incorporated an independent nonprofit called the Neighborhood Land Trust. And then they incorporated a second independent nonprofit called Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. They registered for charitable status for NLT, Neighborhood Land Trust, and not for PNLT. So now they have these two organizations that are linked. NLT is the one that actually owns all of the land trust property. It can also issue tax receipts for donations it has a closed membership where its only member is PNLT, and so its board is therefore small and appointed by the board of PNLT. PNLT, on the other hand, has a membership that's open to anyone in the Parkdale community with a specific class of membership for core members, that is residents. And the board is elected by the membership and, again, appoints the board of NLT. So because it's a charity, NLT is limited in its ability to kind of do political advocacy, but PNLT can do that kind of work, and it isn't subject to the same restrictions. They've stressed that while this arrangement works well for them, it might not work in every community. For instance, it might not work if you don't have a massive supply of engaged community members who are willing to participate in boards and committees. Another consideration is that this kind of structure can be confusing. There are legal fees involved in setting it up and maintaining it and exploring challenges, and there's a bit more administration required in kind of maintaining the financial and legal records and administration of two organizations and two boards. But this is just one example of how you might solve your meet your specific goals using a kind of unique organizational form. And I wrap up there. Thank you so much.